Yeah, let with apologies, I have to start showing some slides for upcoming sessions, and then we enter into this session today. Next week, instead of we doing any session here at our regular place, uh, Aligarh Alumni Association, our local association here in Washington, D.C., is celebrating its 50th anniversary, a Golden Jubilee celebration. It's part of that lecture. Uh, we are also encouraging our audience to participate. It has a different link. It's a Zoom link and its Facebook link will be different. Maybe Rafat or Faisal can put it there on the in the chat. So please attend this. It is at the same time with a different link. And it is on Cersei's vision, our mission, AMU Alumni Building tomorrow for today's challenges. Professor Yasmin Saikia from the University of Arizona. And David will be doing the introductory remarks. And as you know, David Lelyveld is a very towering figure in the legal movement and on Cersei. So next slide will be just uh, very rare for us to have no Zoom session. So next coming week, we will not be having the Zoom session, but Aligarh Alumni Association is doing at the same time. So we consider it as part of that. So next to that is no October 4 session. So that is where we will not have anything. And after that, we have next is Professor Anisur Rahman's. We returned back and on October 11, The Essential Ghalib by Professor Anisur Rahman, who has written this book and which is really getting reviewed very heavily and people are reading it and it is becoming very popular. And he will be joined by two other scholars of Ghalib or Urdu literature, Timsal Masood from Colombia and Surinder Deval here from Washington, D.C. Now with this all introductions and all those announcements, let's finish this and now come back to our today's session. And now I welcome you all. Salam, namaste, and adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we have Professor Gyanendra Pandey from Emory. He is a very distinguished professor and director of colonial and post-colonial studies workshop at the Department of History of Emory University. And the topic is Men at Home, which is the title of the book also, Imagining Liberation in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. He will be formally introduced by Professor Kamran Asdar Ali Sahab, who is a professor and chair of Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. And the concluding remarks will be given by Professor Swapna Banerjee, professor of history at Brooklyn College, New York. All these are most scholars of South Asian heritage, especially the Muslim heritage, and they talk about gender, colonial past, post-colonial studies. And so welcome you all. And now I invite Professor Kamran Asdar Ali Saab for the formal introductory remark. Kamran Saab.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Razi Saab, and to Indian Diaspora for inviting me to give the introductory remarks for Professor Gyan Pandey's session today. I feel very honored and humbled. I have sort of jotted some things down, so please bear with me. And so as all of you know, as Razi Saab also mentioned, Professor Pandey is the Art Sciences Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at Emory University. Prior to his being at Emory, he was professor and department chair as well in anthropology at the Johns Hopkins University. And before that, he was professor of modern history at University of Delhi. He's also taught at University of Allahabad and also was associated with the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Kolkata. He received his BA honors from St. Stephen's College and proceeded as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, where he earned his DPhil in South Asian history under the supervision of Professor Tapan Ray Chaudhary. Professor Pandey has written widely on subjects of South Asian history, on colonial and post-colonial theme, and is one of the founding members of the Subaltern Studies Collective. Of course, I can't, basically give you the numbers and the various and cite chapter and verse all the books and the articles and the edited volumes and all the amazing contribution to the subject of South Asian history and more that he has done. But among the more recent books, of course, is the one we are going to discuss today, Men at Home, Imagining Liberation in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. Other books include Memory, History, and the Question of Violence, The Construction of Communalism in Colonial India, Remembering Partition and History of, and also the book History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States. These are just some of the very few publications that I'm citing here or sort of sharing with you here. The list is very, very long. Apart from, like I said, many edited volumes, Professor Pandey has written or has been the author of numerous articles and papers that have shaped the contours of modern South Asian history. Let me begin a little bit about his involvement with the Subaltern Studies project as it starts in the early 1990s. Professor Pandey's association with Subaltern Studies Collective impacted and reoriented South Asian history and South Asian studies away from colonial and nationalist perspectives and toward a people's histories. This trend in Indian historiography was linked to the emergence of post-colonial studies as a valid space for critique and introspection about the histories of the non-West. Subaltern studies and his involvement in the project opened up the methodological arena of reading archives against the grain and paying attention to silences and to bring forward subaltern voices. These interventions made it possible for many scholars, including myself, to not only deconstruct nationalist narratives, but also to question, quote unquote, the West as the harbinger of all history. This paradigmatic shift in Indian historiography inspired new scholarships not only in India, but in most of the global South, especially in Latin America, Africa, and other places. I would safely say that South Asian historiography since the 80s has not been the same, and Professor Pandey's work has been at the forefront of this really seismic change in the way we think about our past. Its emphasis on social history, critical histories of colonialism, engendered by discourse analysis, as well as critical exploration of Indian capitalism, reflections on history itself, and attention paid to alternative social and political imaginaries and struggles, or methodologically to the small voices of history small voices of history that could illuminate uh, history from the ground up. This introduction was important because I also, as a graduate student in the late 80s, early 90s, first encountered the work of Professor Pandey in one of the volumes that he had edited. And in the volumes that were coming out, the edited volumes that were coming out of the Subaltern Studies Collective, and especially the volume he had edited with Professor Partha Chatterjee in the early 1990s. And then I came across his article that was in the journal Representation. It was definitely an important moment in my own intellectual growth as the work opened me to the possibility of not only thinking about historical process, the question of evidence and the archive from a very different perspective, but I was equally impressed by the sensitivity he brought to the discussion of violence, sectarian violence, and he worked on this particular communal riot in Bhagalpur, Bihar in 1989. Taking on the question of how to represent and narrate sectarian violence, the article methodologically emphasized the expansion of the archive by bringing in other voices, the fragments of Indian society. the minority religious and caste communities, tribals, industrial workers, peasants, activists, women's voices. The minority practices in opposition to the universalizing voice of mainstream nationalist history, which was always upper caste and elite. And this theme sort of continues in most of his work, even on his, and I'll talk about it, even on his work on caste and race in India and the United States. His effort was to destabilize and decenter the state narrative and the desire to normalize and homogenize history, the myths of nationalist history. In this endeavor, A Weaver's Diary, Julahas, whom he had also written about in his book on communalism in India, poems by unknown poets, local traditions, women's songs, all together in, and these were the archives that he was using, these discarded archives. These are not the formal places, but these fragments, all contested state attempt to create a neat and unified history. Similarly, Professor Pandey's discussion on partition violence in his book Remembering Partition, which came out in 2002, suggests the histories of struggle normally, how that he suggests that how histories of struggle normally evacuate the messiness, the uncertainties and confusion that prevail in such processes. What happens in such moments of extreme violence, like the partition, he argues, is passed on as mundane and inconsequential, not worthy of remembrance and accommodation in the formal archives of nation and the community. He poses the question regarding how to access such past, like the partition, the violence of partition, which is, of course, narrated in very different ways, as an aberration, as a one-off. The omissions, inclusions, or he also emphasizes, along with his colleague from Delhi University, Professor Shahid Amin, what is the relationship between memory and record? How to construct a more nuanced narrative, how to put the problems of archives on display. Of course, he raises this issue to reopen the question of how certain histories are erased from national memory, and we may need to find traces of these forgotten moments in various archives and writings. In this theoretical and methodological argument, that he presents in his books and papers, he gingerly makes a more general point about recording the history of those who are inaudible in the grand narrative of history projects through a methodology that incorporates a diversity of ideas, images, and genres of writing. And this has been just pivotal for my generation and even earlier generation of historians to really, really think beyond the formal and the universalizing history or nationalist historiographies. This focus on marginal histories and fragments also informs his work on the comparative history of African Americans and Dalit struggles. I just quote, in clear prose in this book, The History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States, he quotes, and I quote, he writes, and I quote, upper caste, because ruling and dominant groups and classes across the globe believe it is their inherited right to rule and to live in special comfort and prosperity. Racism, because that is a way of keeping subordinate and marginalized groups, sometimes called minorities, in their place. And because the assumption of the right to rule property and culture leads to segregation and subordination of those without privileged access to these and to their denigration, castigation, and even expulsion at times when they are seen as challenging the existing order of caste and race, black and white. Now, this is the consistent and exemplary effort he brings to his writing, a history of those who are excluded, who are marginalized, who are oppressed. Let me end by saying very few general things about the book itself that is under discussion today. I'm sure Professor Banerjee will expand on it and with a detailed analysis. For me, the book is about the modern South Asian male self in British India and in the post-colonial moment. It is an instructive piece of writing and has to be placed along with the various memoirs, published diaries, private letters, and autobiographies of men and women in the past century in order to create a history of the private in South Asia. Such texts do help in creating an archive in order to construct a narrative that may only be available, again, his whole sort of methodological intervention right from the beginning that may only be available in small fragments. They resemble, as the historian John Scott reminds us, an archaeological reconstruction of a pot from shards that and pieces found in a dig, enabling us to tell a story that is generally underrepresented in literature. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I should also say, please join your hands and welcome Professor Gyan Pandey.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Razibhai,
Yes,
do you want me to go or do you want?
yes, yes. Of course. You.
Okay. First of all, I need to say, what else are friends for? After that introduction from Kamran, the most appropriate response would be for me to say nothing. And let Shapna come in with my apologies to Kamran Bhai and Professor Banerjee. If you don't mind, I will use the informal form of address since we're old friends and colleagues and have worked together for a long time. And the same with Razi Bhai and his colleagues. I know that Razi will not accept my silence, so I will. Therefore, I had to do some preparation and think about what I'd say about a book that is out already and that a few of you may have read. I suppose I should say something because there will be some people, many people in the audience who have not had the chance to read it. I had actually thought of two different ways that I could present this material. After what Kamran has said, I'm going to take the simpler route and go, in a sense, chapter by chapter, just saying what I'm trying to do in the book, and come back to some of the more general propositions that Kamran is talking about, if necessary, because he's done it very eloquently, better than I probably would already. All that said, may I just begin by thanking Razi Bhai and his co-organizers of the DC Forum and all the others involved in hosting this and bringing us together today, hosting this session. And special thanks to Professor Kamran Asghar Ali and Professor Shapna Banerjee for their willingness to take the time to come and talk today. They have written about this subject in powerful, learned ways, and you will enjoy hearing what they have to say more than anything I have to say. But in any event, thanks to all of you. Thank you for coming. And Razibhai, as you can see from my thanks already, my promise to keep to 20 or 30 minutes may not happen easily. Please just tell me when you want me to stop 5 minutes before that, and I will wind up. There's no problem with that. So with that, let me just, as I said, take the book seriatim, if you like, beginning with its themes and questions, or I think of those as its themes and questions. Others might think it's hopes and aspirations, with a big question mark. But in any event, the things that I wanted to attend to may best be described if I read you just the first two paragraphs, very short ones, from the prelude of the book, because I tried to say it concisely there. So let me just start with that. This book is an essay on men's existence in the South Asian domestic world and on their self-contradictory articulation in that world of ideas of freedom or liberation for themselves and their loved ones, women, children, family, community, nation, and more. The work begins by situating men firmly in the domestic arena, a domain they and others quite often treat as incidental to their lives and being. Yet, my argument is that men depend crucially upon the domain of the domestic, and indeed spend, I was going to say a great deal of their time, but it may be better to say most of their living hours in industrial and post-industrial societies, certainly, within that domestic domain, dependent upon it, even while pretending that it's incidental to their lives, that their real lives are somewhere else, are outside. And so that ambivalent presence-absence of men in the domestic space, in what is a very large part of their lives, perhaps the most important part of their lives, the pretense that that is simply backgrounds, just happens to be there, incidental to their real lives, which are somewhere else, their real lives in mission. That's what the book investigates. It does so by examining the rhetoric surrounding that presence-absence, the ambivalent relationship to the domestic, the kind of justifications that are given, the discourses that are presented to justify that absent presence, presence absence, and I try and document that or work through that throughout the book. One more thing I need to say with some emphasis. Everyone knows that South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, let alone Sri Lanka and Bhutan and other parts of South Asia, is a huge multinational nation community. Multinational nations coming together, diversities of all kinds. Among those, obviously, class diversities and the notion of the respectable and the bade log and the chote log, the people who inherit status, power, privilege, and those who inherit the opposite, the lack of status, the lack of power, the lack of privilege, except in very small domains. This is such a fundamental part of life in the entire world, but very much so here, and so commonly denied, so commonly overlooked because it is so common, that I want to emphasize that what I'm saying does not apply to all classes, does not apply to all regions of the country, does not apply even within one region to all kinds of people. Indeed, within the same class, the same community, the same stratum of society, families and individuals and struggles are different. And it is important to mark that this book, for all its claims and aspirations and hopes, is not a book about domesticity at large in the country. And in order to signal that, what I've done is I've focused upon three different groups or three different assemblages, groupings, which seem to me to capture a great deal of that diversity and variation in domestic lives and struggles and aspirations and so on and so forth. The first two of those are Hindu and Muslim elite groups. The Bhadra Lok, as they're called in Bengal, the Bade Log, as I said earlier, and the Ashraf throughout northern India and through Hyderabad and other parts of the country where Muslim communities describe their diversities and so on. So two of the assemblages I'm concerned with centrally are these elite groups, in order to show the differences among the elite groups and the commonalities across those religious divisions, etc., regional divisions. But then I take, and this is important to my argument, even if it is not filled out as adequately, the writings are not of the same order, but the writings are phenomenally important. I take as a counterpoint what the activists have described as their community as the Dalits, the groups who were called untouchables for a very long time, ex-untouchables, militant sections of the lowest castes and classes, and what the domestic world is there. And, once again, the variations, that fundamental difference comes through in a lot of the writings, including in the autobiographical statements, which are collective statements much more than the autobiographical statements of the elite individuals and families I talk about. They come through in that way, and yet I want to stress once again the entitlement of men and the apparent lack of awareness that they live with those entitlements, those claims, and that arrogance, and that hierarchy as well, and what they depend upon. This is elided in astonishing ways, even in the Dalit counterpoint. And so I try and work with that. So that's at the most general level what I was hoping that the book might address. Here's what the different chapters seek to do. And I'll just take them seriatim, as I said, because that may be the best way of introducing a book that as I said, many of you will certainly not have had the opportunity to read. And many of you may not be inclined to read after this conversation, which is fine too, because we have interests of particular kinds and inheritances of what counts most and what's most important. And, this is my inheritance, my concerns from childhood on in many ways. Many of the works and writings that Kamran so generously alluded to are actually things that are about things, aspects of behavior, of arrangement that I have noticed from childhood on, and that have bothered me in various ways from childhood on. And this was one of them too. In any event, what the chapters do the book is divided into three parts. In part one, there are two chapters, which is a consideration basically of historical and historiographical legacies. And I chart that through a history of what is called the domestic world. Kamran called it the private. And one of the things that he would obviously himself stress straight away is what is the private in a world of this kind? And how is the private constituted? And how private can it be, right? Even when the struggle is actually to produce a private, the intimate community, the place of retreat and so on. So I speak about that at some length in Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and so on. One speaks of Ghar Sansar without batting an eyelid. Ghar Sansar, the home world. It's a compound word. In English, you've got to write the world in the home in the world. You take several paragraphs to try and to explain to people the home is not cut off from the world. This is dramatically true in the case of the Dalits, obviously, of working people in general who live. They don't have four walls around their domestic space quite often. But it is dramatically true even of the elite groups. They do not inhabit a home which is confined to the four walls of their house. And so the second chapter there is about housing patterns, the physical structures in which people lived, and whether they are four walls or whether they are not, how they are imbricated in so much that is around there. Those are the background chapters. They also deal with the historiography. And then I move to part two, which in English I've called Practices. In a Hindi Rupantar, a Hindi transcreation of this book, which I'm working on with my colleague Rajiv Tiwari from a distinguished Hindi professor's family. Rajiv is here, so thank you for being here, Rajiv. In that Rupantar, I renamed that section, Practices, as Kartavya, Swadharma. One can talk of it as dharma, but I'm stressing Swadharma here because there is a new notion of what one's Swadharma, one's allotted task, mission in life is. And that is no longer given to you only by religious texts. It is self-appointed, it is self-elected. And that's what this section, this whole part is about, this particular part entitled Practices in English. And it has 3 chapters. The first of these is called Duty in English. I called it Sodharm, we called it Sodharm in the Hindi translation. What the people I deal with in this chapter, and many of them are very well-known political and intellectual leaders, writers, activists, the president of the first president of India, Rajendra Prasad, Gandhi comes into it, Ambedkar comes into it. There are all kinds of people of significance here. The point that I think I want to make most strongly in that chapter is that these leaders, thinkers, reformers, makers of modern India are struggling, have made it their task to make work respectable. I stress that. They want to make physical and intellectual work respectable, because for the upper classes, for aristocratic peoples, for the elite, the Bhadralok and the Bade Log in general, and for the Ashraf, work was a demeaning thing. It was what the lower classes and so on did. It was what fallen women did. There is, as it happens very interestingly, no particular word that describes work in general. Work is Pesha is the closest you come to it. And Pesha is what the lowest classes do or lower classes do, and what fallen people, those who, outside the thing, Baijis do and Devdasis do, and it's their Pesha. These people, the leaders of this time, the later 19th century on through the early decades of the 20th, very strongly, they made it their mission to make work respectable. And I make the argument that in this they succeeded remarkably. Work, both intellectual and physical to a large extent. I mean, Ambedkar stresses this, but so do all the others, becomes very significant. What is missing is a recognition of work in the domestic space as work. So there's a performance of things that excludes the largest part of the world that these people inhabit. And that chapter is concerned with this kind of what are the consequences of this contradictory mission, contradictory task. The mission of making work respectable, work of all kinds, and the failure to recognize the work of the everyday, the labor that goes into running a home, the labor that goes into running making the resources of upper class society, recognizing much of that even as work that needs to be noticed in historical writing. That's what that first chapter does. And I want to stress that the contradictions of that are shown among these remarkable leaders. They really are remarkable. They have thought through a great deal. They have articulated quite brilliantly, quite exceptionally, ways of being in the modern world, which say it is our mission, it is our duty to work for the uplift of all in the here and now, not in some afterward, as might traditionally have been the case. But in doing all of that, they too treat the domestic world as already given, as background, as something that must continue to be what it has always been in their view. Okay. The second chapter in that section is called Discipline. And I move here to the next generation, if you like, which I call the partition and independence generation. People who lived through the period of partition and independence across the subcontinent. And many of whom, the Muslim Ashraf amongst them, some of the families I write about, moved from India to Pakistan because they were professionals who had to make that kind of choice at this time. But for all of them, it seems to me, there is an important and quite remarkable statement of the need for self-discipline and the disciplining of others, the disciplining of wards, children, family, but of a wider community, the disciplining and teaching of this wider community in the needs of modern citizenship, in the needs of the new nation, the needs of welfare and secularism and modernity, and to make the good society. In all of this, there is a kind of dedication by people who are not political leaders automatically. Some of them are political activists too, but they're poets like Bachchan, Harvansh Bachchan. They are educationists like Akhtar Hussain Raipuri, and they're policemen like Akbar Mirza. These are people that I write about. For all of them, there is this need for self-discipline and the disciplining of all around them, their loved ones particularly, but more than that, for the work of the nation and the future, the modernity. Okay. In all of this, once again, there's a very interesting kind of treating of the domestic space as background, as a space that you already know that you occupy, where women, even if they're to be educated, and girls, if they're to be educated, must continue to do what they have always done. And one of the most striking things about this whole period is how these men don't seem to be aware of the kind of entitlement they live with, and how they refuse to work, because many of them are professionals, many of them are in the best universities, many of them are writers, thinkers, activists. They refuse to 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 develop intimate relationships, if you like, with women of their caliber, of their standing, of their age even. And they tend, in the end, to marry people very much younger. There are exceptions to that. But the choice so often is people who are 10 years younger, 15 years younger, in some cases 20 and 25 years younger, right? In one or two cases, they're right about 30 years younger. So what leads to that kind of choice? And once again, it is a thing about men being in control, doing what they have always done, women and girls doing new things, but necessarily continuing to do what they have always done, which is not marked as a mission, as calling in life. That's chapter 2 of that section, and then the last chapter I have called dignity, and that is about the Dalits, where I suggest that respectability has a different meaning, and where I suggest too that work is celebrated from the beginning, because labor is how families survive, labor is how individuals and groups survive, and the community survives. And labor is now tied very, very fundamentally to education. Labor for education, an education that will liberate not the people who are who worked through the 1920s and 30s and so on as landless laborers, as untouchables, in farms, in the countryside, or in big cities like Bombay and Ahmedabad and Kanpur and Allahabad and wherever it might be, Kolkata, and southern India, which I don't write about because I don't know the languages and so on. But for the Dalits, labor and education particularly, is the path for liberation of the next generation. And that is a very different context for domestic life and for the ways in which, and the women, once again, are to the fore in this, and particularly because they are working people. They're out of the home all of the time. They're already in the public sphere, as it were. But the women who are to the fore are nonetheless second rate in the home, wherever that home is. There are many things that they do and they do alone, such as washing of clothes, Even the cooking, men will sometimes cut vegetables, but they will never do the cooking. They will never wash the clothes. They will never wash children's dirty clothes. They will never clean the shit, as it were. That's fundamentally the point. The women have to do all of that work, and it's taken as given. It's standard. So once again, I work through that, and I work uh, um, through it with returning to Ambedkar because he's such a great inspiration for many of these people, but through the writings of people who became Dalit autobiographers, memoirists, writing about their parents' struggles, their grandparents' struggles, and their own struggles in the period from the 1920s, 30s, more dramatically through the 50s and 60s. And these books are written at the end of the 20th century. Their writings, they emerge when the Dalit movement reaches its height, as it were. Exactly. So that's what happens there. Now, Razi bhai, how many minutes do I have left?
15 plus.
Okay, okay. Then I may be able to just take a bit longer on some of the other parts. I then have a final section which I'll come to. The final section is called History in a Visceral Register, which is how does it feel to be there in that location. But I'll come back to that in a second. This is closer to what Kamran Bhai was talking about in his introductory remarks. And as I said, he did it so well, I probably don't need to go over all of this again. But here are the general underlying questions and propositions that I hope this book will convey and that I want to make. One of the first is what counts as history, what counts as archive, and more broadly then, what is it that is accepted, that is taken as an acceptable form of knowledge production, and indeed of knowledge. What counts as knowledge? Just like history, what counts as knowledge? And this is where I make a distinction in this book very forcefully, but it was implicit in some of my earlier books, between what I have called world history, with capital W and a capital H. I'm taking the phrase from Hegel, something that Ranjit Guha, our elder mentor to a large extent in subaltern studies, has written about at great length. So between world history, which I will talk about in a minute, and I stress the history of the everyday labor, the continuous performance of repetitive drudgery in the home and outside, upon which the resources of the family, of the individual, of the men, but of the community, of the nation, of the upper classes. All of those are built, which is exactly what the Dalits claim when they say, we are Dalits, we are the suppressed, we are the people on whose backs, on whose labor, the rest of you live and prosper and have the privileges that you have. So I want to talk about this with two different thoughts. One about the archive. I've written at some length on unarchived histories in many places. And I want to make the point that the unarchived histories we are talking about, this is the histories of the people whose histories are not written, basically, okay? All of the people whose histories have not counted as history. Beginning with the whole of Africa, which was supposed to have had no history, according to Hegel and according to a lot of them, because it didn't have written records and didn't have the state. Nonetheless, we are concerned with the histories of peoples without history, as the anthropologists and historians described it. Histories of people whose history has never been accepted as history. And the proposition I made in unarchived histories, in my writing on unarchived histories initially, was this, that these histories are not histories without an archive. It is not that they are unarchived because there is no archive. They are, in my view, deliberately unarchived. It is a volition, it is an act of choice that makes these not histories, and if they are acknowledged as things that happened in the past, then how can you write about it? There is no archive for it. So there is a general proposition about what the archive is, which is what the state gives you, what is put into repositories in DC and in every good university, and in national archives all over the world, and in state archives all over the world. That is what the discipline of history has emphasized. I am saying no, the unarchived histories are histories that are deliberately, volitionally, by choice, unarchived because others are privileged as history. And the pointer, I think the inference that I would like people to take out of that is, in the end, the archive is our questions. The same material, the same files, the same things that you go to, the same memories, the same autobiographies, you name it, the same oral accounts, they yield different kinds of information, different kinds of histories, if we ask different questions. And therefore, the proposition I would make strongly is the archive is our questions, which is a huge remove from the proposition that archives are given to you. Go look for another archive if you can't find it in this one. I will say, as subaltern studies and many others said from the beginning, Joan Scott was saying it, feminist historiography, post-colonial writing everywhere, borderland studies, all sorts of groups have been making these points, that the same sources yield other information. They yield other histories if you go to them with different questions. And that is the proposition that I would like to make about unarchived histories. Deliberately unarchived, and what is more, the archives are all there. Everything that is available to us will yield different kinds of information if we go to it with different kinds of questions. Related to that, and pointedly focused in the last part of this book of Men at Home, is, as I said, this part is called History in a Visceral Register. And in the book, I say visceral register means how it feels to be there. And that's a fair point. Many of my students asked me about this repeatedly, and people in audiences in various places discussing my earlier commentaries on this thing asked, well, how do you write history in a visceral register? And my first answer there was that it's really a question of asking the question. Once you ask, then you're already on your way to writing a history in the visceral register. And the way I described it was, it's an attempt to touch how it feels, something you cannot do, right? But it's an attempt to touch what is not touched. That's how I described it. But I have since then, as I do in this book, I mean, I go back to things I've read before. In the book, I go back to Premchand's second wife, Shivrani Devi's account of Premchand's life in the home, where she writes Premchand Ghar Mein. And when I read it for the nth time, I discovered what I had been missing and what I needed to emphasize. And it made me rethink my book very substantially. It gave shape to my book. Hindustani Aadmi Ghar Mein is a direct copying, borrowing from Shivrani Devi's work and thoughts, Premchand Ghar Mein. Okay. In the same way, I turned to Baby Kamle's autobiography, and Zina Amsa, and I found a word there called Navrapana. husbandness, which was her description of men's privilege and men's claim that men's authority, men's rights, men's privileges, men's behavior in the home all stemmed from, she said, this thing, which is naurapana, um, husbandness, husbandly authority, husbandly behavior. Okay, and once again, just that one word, naurapana, which I'm prepared to discuss more if anyone wants to ask questions about it. That made me rewrite when I had finished, when Razi Bhai, you all had invited me to present an earlier version. I thought I'd finished the draft. I was sending it off to press. I came across this particular thing and I went back to Bombay, discovered Ambedkar's houses and the sorts of dwellings that people lived in and how much they changed. That made me rewrite a lot. But Naurapana itself made me rethink a great deal and reframe a great deal of what I was writing in this book. In the same way, I'm sorry, there was a long-winded way of coming to what I wanted to come to, which is I reread Walter Benjamin, whom many of you will know, and those who don't know, he is a remarkable intellectual of the 1930s. What is he committed? Suicide in 1940, trying to escape the Nazis and Nazi rule. Because he couldn't escape, or he thought he couldn't escape in any way. Benjamin has a wonderful phrase which I had unthinkingly already referred to in an earlier book, and I'll quote that in a moment. But he calls history in a visceral register, he gives it a name which I will give it now. He calls it a gestal history, a history of gestures. And he invokes the great playwright and theater person, Bertolt Brecht, and he invokes the great novelist, Franz Kafka, to say what makes their greatness, what makes their theater and their novels so much of a departure, such a break, such a remarkable eye-opening move, is that they emphasized gestures as far more important than words, than dialogue, than the speeches that people, theater actors make. They attended to gesture because gestures tell you a great deal more. After all, words should include silence. Music does include necessarily the gaps between the notes. Paintings does include all that is not painted, in the framing, but as well as that's left out of paint, right? All of these things are part of the gestures that Brecht emphasized very strongly, that what theater should be a work through gestures. And Kafka says that's what his novels, his writings will be about. And that's what I'm suggesting. History should be about an investigation of gestures. And I will, with apologies to all of you, just go back for a second and quote, if I can find it quickly, something I said on this in an earlier book, and I reproduce it at the end of this book. Okay, here it is, and it's in an early part of the book, and I stress here the question of what the archive is. This is written originally in A History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States. But I had already gestured towards this sort of thing in my partition book, I think, implicitly. I'm not suggesting I was aware of all of this. These were things that were happening. But in the History of Prejudice, I write how, out of what archive are we to write a history of gestures so deep-rooted that they may not be noticed even by the perpetrators. Gestures that are just automatic, they're a part of your being. And I then give examples. This is quoting myself with apologies. The spat out, half suppressed, almost unconscious gesture of disdain, of contempt and disgust, the pause and the recoil, the refusal to touch what in India was for so long and actually continues to be called untouchability. How do we understand racism or casteism or discrimination on basis of caste, class and gender? By those gestures, far more than by words that are articulated, right? And so I called in the last part of this book for a writing of history in a visceral register, a gestural history, a history of gestures, which doesn't dismiss the narratives or the words or the speeches or the dialogue, but makes it part of a wider archive and a wider source base, in which the gestures tell us far more than that graphic written account or non-written oral account might tell us. So that's an important part of what happens in the last section of this book on Men at Home, History in a Visceral Register, where I actually begin with a list of things that men touched and did not touch, an impossible task. But I said, all right, let's begin. Let's give it, make an effort to think what are the things they do touch and how do they touch them and what do they refuse to touch. And the list itself, whatever list we come up with, will be fascinating and remarkably important, it seems to me. But there's more to it than that. And I want to just say all of this coexists with what I began with, the inextricable intertwining of world history, as Hegel called it, and the history of the everyday. World history for Hegel is the history of the state coming into being, the history of the spirit realizing itself. These are things already given. World history is, when boiled down to the discipline of history, is wars, conquests, loot, exploitation, the power to rule, the establishment of structures like states, state-like structures, revolutions, world transforming events, which are usually about great ideas and great people and prime ministers and presidents. I mean, in the United States, much of history used to be written as a history of all the presidents. And it took a long time before other things became part of history. The African American struggle, the struggle against the carceral state today. I want to stress once again, it's casteism, it's racism, it's discrimination on basis of gender and class and so on, other hierarchies, that we want to write a history of. It does not figure much of the time in what is called world history. It figures, on the other hand, if one pays attention, and this book tries to do that, how successfully you will say, it figures in the history of the everyday labor, everyday repetitive drudgery, the labor that is not even work, is not recognized as work, reproduction, survival, the maintenance of individuality, family, relationships of all kinds, of human being, right? All of that is this kind of work in the everyday, which is not counted as history. And so I juxtapose in this book, more forthrightly than I've done in others, world history and the history of the everyday. Okay, and I ask the question right at the end: what is the necessary here? What is the necessary and what is the contingent in this reconstruction of the human past and present, of societies as they are and of societies as they've been? What is the necessary here? The thunder and lightning of world historical events, which is how Hegel would have it, and which is how most historians' histories have had it until recently. And what is the contingent, the incidental, as it is called, the trifling, the stuff that can almost not be noticed, need not be noticed, it's trifling. And what this is the matter of survival and reproduction of the species and its surroundings, of companionship and care and human being, as I said, in an environment that is peopled not only by humans, but also by non-human life, and necessary animate and inanimate objects of many, many, many different kinds, which huge numbers of people are writing about and have been writing about for a long time. I just try and focus it in this particular instance around the domestic world in South Asia. And I say we need to ask the question, what is necessary and what is contingent? And I would say the necessary is the history of the everyday. What is contingent is the history of world-shattering events, that they happen. What continues and what actually ensures human being, social being, societies, and their survival is the everyday, the history of the everyday. I will stop there. I'm sure I've taken longer than I needed to, but thank you so much, Kamran Saab, and thank you, Razi Bhai, for giving me the time, and thank you, the rest of you, for listening to me. Many, many thanks.
It's so inspiring and so challenging also. You made us to start thinking what is every day what we are supposed to be doing and making it important and consider it that we are doing something part of our history. So Swapna ji, please conclude with the with more powerful some more thoughts so that we can inhale.
Yes, sure. My heartfelt thanks to you, Razi Bhai, Ali Bhai, and this members of this illustrious panel. My very, very uh, deep gratitude goes to, of course, Professor Pandey, and I'm going to refer to you as Gyan, as I call you, for making me a part of this journey and asking me to be a commentator on this panel. I have been kind of living and breathing with this book since Professor Pandey was writing it. I read it for the third time. When I finished, I still felt the same level of satisfaction and gratitude and enriched by what Gyan shared with us. I also thank my friends, family, students, and colleagues in different continents who are joining this event and listening to this very stimulating conversation. Now, we historians, scholars think alike. So a lot of what you're going to hear from me may sound repetitive, but this might also allow us our thought to contemplate what we maybe, like-minded historians, I myself, like Professor Ali, who have been trained and who grew in this generation when subaltern studies first met their presence in the historical, in the landscape of historical scholarship. So I was deeply inspired by their ways of thought and what I'm going to, and I also practice similar kind of history and that Gyan has professed before us. So let me begin. I have a very lengthy commentary because I kept writing and writing, taking notes, but I'm going to share just a little bit of it, only a fraction, and ask a few questions and leave it to the audience to explore them at different levels, I would say. So as we know, Gyan Pandey, founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, has a long history of speaking in defense of the fragments, of privileging the particular over the general. In this new book, he addresses a fragment that is not a broken piece, but an integral, and I quote, a part of a disruption and interruption in Indian public life, end quote. By focusing on inner lives of men through their own words and that of their partners, spouses, Pandey delineates an intimate history that is yet to be explored in South Asian scholarship. The work is compelled by a sense of redressing the wrongs and addressing everyday violence, discrimination, injustice, and humiliation that are embedded in structures of discrimination and denial in privatized domestic spaces. So these are the last few words are also Gyan's words. His queries are animated by personal questions and convictions that closer investigation of historical domestic interactions is imperative for a realistic understanding of Indian modernity, democracy, and social conservatism that lingers from colonial to post-colonial India. In my assessment, and I hope most of you will agree, this book is a major intervention in feminist scholarship and in gender, men, and masculinity studies. By drawing on predominantly men's and also women's autobiographies, biographies, fictions, and ethnohistory, you, again, have constructed a textured and a nuanced biography of Indian families from the late colonial and the post-colonial period. Historiographically speaking, by squarely establishing men at home, you disrupt the distinction between the home and the world and elucidated where your colleague, Parthu Chatterjee, left off. Chatterjee argued how middle-class ideologues subjected men to a second patriarchy by dividing the world into the private and the public, the inner and the outer, the spiritual and the material, and so on. Through close reading of your sources, you demonstrate that the home is a vital playing field for both men and women, where men, through everyday acts of intimacy and violence, forged, negotiated, and shaped their identities and entitlements. By exploring stories of desires and longing, of expectations and hierarchies within multi-generational South Asian families, you underscore the power dynamics that governed men-women relationship across caste, class, and religious divides. More importantly, your close attention to men as both present and absent figures. They were present in the decision-making processes at home, yet absent when it came to emotional support and physical labor and care. These highlights the ambivalences and contradictions that characterized modern Indian men. And you write into the history following the call that Dipesh Chakraborty has long given on writing into the history of our modernity, the contradictions and the ambivalences. And that comes out very strongly in this work. Your focus on the large Hindi belt and down south, the Maharashtra region, further expands the scope of the study. It is also a welcome departure from the Bengali Bhadralok. Nonetheless, as a history of ordinary life among ordinary people, as you call it, told from the location of the home, your book intersects with my own work in emphasizing the deeply tangled relationship between the inner and the outer, the ghar and the bahir as a continuum, and the importance of underscoring the everydayness in the writing of larger national, colonial, post-colonial histories. I loved the format of the book. As you have actually explained, it comes in 3 sections: legacies, practices, and history in a visceral register. And in this 3 sections, you cover a very wide spectrum from the Hindu and Muslim families to Dalit writers, leaders, and ordinary downtrodden people, men and women. You situate both the subaltern men and elite men within their familial domestic space to interrogate questions of the Indian modern. Your early chapters juxtapose men's commitment to national and public professional responsibilities with their conjugal and public lives and personal lives, thereby revealing the contradictions that they inhabited. For example, also underlying your study, your deep engagement with the lives of these men and women, a certain questions that I could see coming up time and again, and I'm going to just touch on one thing from the earlier sections. So, for example, in the legacy section of the book, the question of masculinity jumps out to me. So, for example, when you talk about Bholanath, Harivansh Bachchan's grandfather, who was trained in wrestling, lathi, and sport play, I see how bahubal or even physical strength played a very important role in creating images of men and manliness even within the domestic domain. So I would ask you more questions along that, but I just wanted to share one example where this question of masculinity, of physical strength, show up. I'm going to turn my attention to the middle section of the book that you cluster around practice. The three facets of practice: duty, discipline, and dignity, that you explained it in your talk. But those duty, discipline, and dignity were anchored in the lived experiences, and they are located in the familial landscape of men and women of different strata and time. The common riff through the book is what constituted home in the long arc of the Indian modern. Your purpose was not to provide a definitive answer, but to highlight the contentious nature of home, uh, 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 and how contingent they were on caste, class, religious, and ethnic belongings. The chapter on duty presents important players. So starting with Babu Rajendra Prasad, Munshi Premchand, Rahul Sankrityayan, to Baba Sahib Ambedkar and Narendra Yadav, for each of these players, duty has a different meaning. Rajendra Prasad represented tradition. He respected family values and filial piety. Premchand, on the other hand, emphasized romantic love, but he still harbored a secret and kind of exhibited a double standard. Sankrityayan, on the other hand, displayed, and all of these writers, they left multi-volume writings. So Sankrityayan, for example, displayed love for life, patriotism, wanderlust, again, revealing many contradictions as his life unfolded through those multi-volumes of writing. And I kept wondering how these traits connected with their professional, the pesha, with their national objectives of building a new nation, as being citizens of an emerging, newly independent India that they were all envisioning, and how they connected with their personal life. And finally, I also think about how all these questions have all these, they are so revealing, each of these narratives, how they tied up with the question of their manliness, purushatva, and masculinity. I especially enjoyed your chapter on discipline, which maps the emotional landscape of conjugal relationships, providing interesting details of two elite Muslim families and that of Harivansh and Teji Bachchan. It reaffirms what you stated in your prelude. The apparently banal term, Navrapana, or husbandness, introduced by the Dalit woman writer Baby Kamble, acts as a linchpin for your argument that, and I quote you, that across caste, classes, and communities in modern South Asia, male authority has been signaled through husbandness. So that is again a very important the inference that I drew from reading through all the chapters throughout the book. So this chapter and the next also foreground women's voice and agency. The following chapter on dignity brings out the subaltern historian in you as a deliberate departure from the elite households to the multi-generational struggling family of the Dalits who nurtured dreams of upward mobility and a new future for their progenies. It immediately reveals that there is no universal model of manhood or a monolithic domestic culture. For the stigmatized, subordinated laboring population, the boundaries between the home and the world and the division of labor were much more blurry and far more permeable. The dignity that constituted the manhood of the Dalits in post-colonial India was hinged on aspirations to educate their male children, on their proper dress and deportment. Dalit women, such as Purna, Vasant Moon's mother, and baby Kamle, playing pivotal roles in shaping the trajectory of their children and families, were a major subversive forces, yet they conformed to patriarchal norms. In this chapter, your earlier discussion of conjugality and romance seems to rapture through wide-ranging sources. So in other words, what we saw in the previous chapters of what came to constitute a modern marriage, what came to constitute the thinking of a modern home, kind of falls apart when we attend to the intimate lives of the struggling Dalits. The last section, which I'm not going to talk about much, but through a wide-ranging sources, you attend to the visceral registers of what constituted ideals of domesticity, masculinity, and femininity, and conjugality, none of which are monolithic or fixed. They're contingent on caste, class, religious status. The educated Dalits in post-colonial India were driven more by Baba Sahib Ambedkar's message of educate, agitate, and organize than by contemplation of domestic ideology hinged on the separation of spheres between men and women. Finally, I think I might be running out of time. I'll take a few more minutes, 5 more minutes. Razi Bhai, do I have?
What?
How many minutes do I have?
Couple of more. Couple minutes. Sorry.
I'll end up shortly. So in the the epilogue, we must come back to the epilogue because it's a bold step that bridges your personal with the professional. And pardon me for saying this, as a privileged, educated, higher caste male, you are not only bold enough to tread on uncomfortable territory, Professor Pandey, but you also did not shy away from sharing a little-known secret of your family story. While providing deep insights into the psyche, behavior, and practices of Indian men, you also create a consternation among your readers. So many times I felt uncomfortable and painful while searching for an answer. Also, you made a huge methodological impact. Staying away from teleological theories, you let your sources speak. You turned the outer-inner dichotomy inside out by reading the public-private lives of men to shed light on their inner beings. I am presuming the motives and audience of these men were very different from your intention and readership. So my first question for you is, what prompted the choice of your sources? Second, I would like you to deliberate a bit on what you meant by men as fragments, as an interruption in a widely received understanding of family life, to quote you. And third, men appeared in your discussion predominantly as conjugal partners, as husbands, leaders, sons, and fathers, both elite and subalterns. I am curious if you would argue that for Indian men, both elites and subalterns, fatherhood was a more important concern than their conjugality. Now, a little bit of a, criticism.
Professor Banerjee,
I'm done.
please hold your question so you can ask. You will be
Okay.
the first to ask the question. So
Oh,
one
okay.
by one.
All right. Okay. So to conclude, I must reiterate that this is a very lucidly written, deeply felt account, a path-breaking work of history. It's a page turner that whets your appetite to learn more. So what's next, Professor Pandey? And on a trivia side, a book that builds on so much on the life of the Bachchan family. Has it been shared with our Bollywood icon? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful concluding remarks. And now we enter the question answer session, moderated by Dr. Rafat Hussain, and he will deal with this.
Thank you, Dr. Aziuddin. So that begins the question and answer session. And before we begin, thank you to all three professors. And we are lucky to have three professors, and Professor Pandey, Professor Ali, and Professor Banerjee. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and, of course, the introduction and concluding remark. So let's begin. So there are two options of asking question. One is you can raise your digital hand or put your comment or question in the chat box. So let's begin with the chat box. I don't see any raised hand. Okay. Dr. Nazir Ahmad, I will come back. So let's begin with the chat box. And there is a question from the Ambassador Ishrat Aziz Saab. The practice of husbands. Oh, hold on for a second. So I promised Professor Banerjee that her question will come first. So is that okay, Professor Pandey, to begin with Professor Banerjee's question, and then I will go to the chat. Do you want to ask again, Professor Banerjee, question? You are on mute. Thank you.
So, but I have, very basic questions. Is number one, where did I lost my yeah. So what prompted your choice of sources? A very basic historical question, because there's no dearth of autobiographies there, but what drove you to these huge compendium of sources and focusing on, and because you drew from very different kinds of, your repertoire of sources is varied, and what was the motivation for choosing them? And I also asked you to deliberate on what you meant by men as fragments, as an interruption in a widely received understanding of family life. Although I understand that, I want you to explain to the wider audience. And the other one is, that I asked was if fatherhood was more important to these men than their conjugality, which was hedged by other dense narratives in these huge compendium of sources that Professor Pandey looked at. Also, I know the last word is, what is strikingly missing in the narrative is any discussion of sexuality. And I wonder if you have anything to share about the affective registers of men at home and the question of sexuality that govern their marital relationships. Thank you.
Do I have a few minutes? So much has been
Please
said.
be brief, but address all of our questions. Thank you.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind, I'll take a few minutes.
Yeah,
beginning-
sure.
Beginning with some thanks, which I
Yeah.
owe to people. I didn't see the names of everyone here. I want to thank my old friends who are here, including the person who went to Oxford with me as a Rhodes Scholar, Johar Bhattacharya, doctor, physiologist in Columbia University for a long time now, living on the West Coast. And I see many other friends, um, students once upon a time, now distinguished colleagues in various places. Thank you all for being here. I saw Barbara Metcalf's name, and I see Abdul Jabbar Sahib, who's my colleague in Emory, whom the last time I met on the same platform, and we have been meaning to meet since then, and not been able to do it. That's the way the world works, even in our little silos. But thank you all for being here, and I want to thank um, two other people significantly. I mean, there are people who've written reviews of this book already. One of them is an old student, now a distinguished colleague, writer, Anuradha Kumar, who's very generously reviewed the book in an online magazine in Delhi. So thank you for being here, Anu. I want, above all, to thank somebody who's not present, because she's out on a journey promoting her own books. My partner, my comrade, my wife, who has been my partner and comrade and intellectual interlocutor. My most important critic and my greatest enthusiast at the same time, Ruby Lal, who's, as I said, she's away. She was critical to this book, so I just want to mention that. In two ways in particular. One is, she said, you're changing the visual of the domestic. Keep that focus. Do not let anything distract you. And so keep the women in the background. Keep the focus on the men, because it is easy for other things to take over, and the visual of the domestic as this world that is peopled by women and children keeps coming back. And I was asked, even in my earlier presentations, why I'm not writing about the women. As it happens, you cannot write about women or men without writing about the other. So I am writing about them the whole time. But it is important to keep the focus on the men, not allow that distraction to happen. I was even asked, well, you're using women's autobiographies. Why are you doing that? Well, you can't win. It seems to me one has to use all the resources that are available, and one must focus centrally the relationships, the attempts at change, and the failure in some ways, or the reconstitution of earlier conditions, even with very significant attempts to change. So all of that said, I also want to thank Shopna, before I get to your questions, for letting me, sending to me, before my book was published, a manuscript version, a proof copy, I think, of her book on fathers in the motherland, which was of enormous importance in helping me think through what I'm saying. So those are important acknowledgements. I should have made some of them earlier. I hadn't seen a list of all of the people who are present. Shapna, I'll start with your questions, and that's probably because otherwise I'll go on too long. What prompted the choices, the sources? And the answer is very clear. For one thing, I was very clear. I must talk about different classes, different groups in the society, people who held different sorts of positions. This was very important to me. And the second thing is, I'm limited, necessary, by my knowledge of certain languages. So the Hindi Urdu stuff was what was available to me. I know enough Marathi to read it, and I use the Marathi sources, and I've worked substantially, as you said, and perhaps Kamran also noticed, in the northern Indian belt, from Bihar to Punjab, to the northwest. And of course, it goes off into Pakistan as well, because there is no divide in that sense, especially in the colonial period. But nor in the post-colonial, we want to stress. But I'm limited by my languages. I could not, therefore, though I refer to Bengali literature because I followed so much of it, I don't know Bengali. And not well enough even to read a review that has just appeared in Bengali and has been sent to me very kindly by the author. I read like a child at the moment when I read Bengali, so it takes me ages. But these were the areas, but they were also important. I refer, of course, in passing to South India and various places, to Bama's writings, which are very significant in writing about Dalits and the changes that have taken place over time from the 19th century to today. But I limit myself to the areas which are huge. It's not a small part of the world. And that determined my choices to a large extent. But it was determined also by what I found. I found phenomenally voluminous writings in Hindi and in Urdu about particular lives, right? And I knew there was a great deal of writing amongst Dalits because I had done that work in an earlier book on the same kinds of questions where they were not focused on the question of the domestic world. And therefore, I chose those individuals, those families, and you could choose many, many more. But to have Rahul Sankrityan's 6-volume autobiography available, and it's like a diary, it's like a daily diary. He puts everything there in an astonishing way in some ways, including his anguish, his sense of guilt, and so on and so forth, even though he overrides it all in some way. In the same way, the joint recollections of domestic life by men and women in many of those cases makes them absolutely fascinating and opens up ways of reading either, both, all together in a very, very different way. So that's basically the reason for choice. The Dalit, as I said earlier, the Dalit memoirs or biographical accounts are collective accounts to a large extent. They are political statements to a large extent. They come out of the Ambedkarite movement, much of what I'm writing about. And yet, and I'm going to move to your third question, or no, I don't know the order, but I'm going to move to another one of your questions, which is about I think you said at one point that the Dalit narratives break up the modern ideal marriage. I want to say the Dalit narratives are also informed by knowledge, by aspirations to the ideal romantic nuclear family, etc. Narendra Jadav's account is full of both things. It is full of the statement of the collective, of the major struggles out of which his generation of educated, remarkably successful professionals come in his family. But he writes the English version of his autobiography, of the family memoir, is very much like a romantic novel of him and his wife. And his own life is lived out very much in that romantic mode, right? So there are two different things happening here, and they often are contradictory of one another in ways that if Narendra was listening just now, he would acknowledge, I think. The writing does not acknowledge it. It breaks up the ideal of what the Dalit collective struggle must be and the ideal of what the modern romantic nuclear family centered domestic life should be. It happens all the time. It happens repeatedly in the Bhadralok world. The idea of the nuclear family, and that's why one or two reviewers actually have done this. It's worth starting with the cover photograph, because the cover photograph documents that moment. And I'm grateful to Kamran Bhai for getting me so many of these photographs. I mean, I could have chosen many others, but this one is a remarkable statement of what the nuclear family is meant to be, what the moment of marriage a romantic marriage between husband and wife who are tucked away in one corner of that photograph. They're completely in one corner. In that commemoration in the year of the marriage, it is a marking of the marriage of this young bride and groom. They are in the right hand top corner of the cover photograph. The nuclear family, the family, we'll have to call it that because it's not a nuclear family in any recognizable sense of the term, but the multi-generational nuclear family is dominated by the elders. Some of whom, they're not even the parents of the bride and groom. They are the elders, the senior most. And this is common, and this is what Kamran writes about in his own writings about left-wing intellectuals and families and what happens in the end. So I want to stress that it is not only that the modern and the ideal marriage, domestic world breaks apart in the narrative of the Dalits. It breaks apart in all of these narratives because the inheritances are different and the contradictions are different. I'm not saying, therefore, that the Dalit experience, the Dalit writings and Dalit histories are the same as those of the Ashraf and Bhadra log, the Bade log and the Chote log have lived and have inheritances which are very. But
Thank you.
yes.
Professor Pandey, there's more, or you addressed all of them?
Was there anything else that fragments you wanted me to address? Do you want me to do it? I'll come back to it. And
Let's go ahead, responding to the other.
I do want to say, and again, this harks back to Shopna's own work and mine. You said, can I say something about masculinity and so on? Is fatherhood more important than conjugality? I would say fatherhood and conjugality go together in this. Your book says this very well, and I want to stress it. What happens to masculinity is a shift from bahubal, the strength of lathis and what have you, military of whatever kind, to learned professions as well as other kinds which are, part of the expression of masculinity. But above all, to what you I think, rightly and pointedly focus, pedagogy. That what masculinity now amounts to, not only as father, but also as husband, as men, is the training, the disciplining of yourself and of those you're responsible for, or think you're responsible for, right? And that is the move in masculinity, in thinking, manliness, that is quite remarkable and quite different from that in many other parts of the world, though aspects of it will be found as well.
Yeah, and you can move on to the others.
Sorry. If Kamran Bhai has anything to...
sorry. Thank you so much. And let's move on to the chat questions. So that is from Ambassador Ishrat Aziz. Saab, the practice of husbands helping in domestic chores is increasing. Any survey or study to show its impact on family life and upbringing of children? You are on mute.
I'm sorry, you might have to just repeat that question one more time.
Sure. The practice of husbands helping in domestic chores is increasing. Any survey or study to show its impact on family life and upbringing of children?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that question. It actually harks back to something that Abdul Jabbar Sahab asked me the last time, and we spoke about. I have to say, my first response is that I'm very pleased to hear this. I'm delighted to hear that men, husbands, fathers are sharing more in domestic chores and so on and so forth. I don't see it quite so much. And I do think what COVID did was to demonstrate in the most remarkable the double burden that women bear, and that they continue to bear, indeed, that they bore with even greater worries and consequences, loss of health and so on. They were doing everything twice over, thrice over within the home. It is not clear to me that men were participating in that fully. I have no doubt that there are individual families and there are individual men who work very, very differently. And I do know that in the 21st century, large numbers of people have recognized what they are not doing. I do still say, and I think this is something I indicate in the epilogue in my own case, that the responsibility of thinking the home, planning the home, the continuous nurturing of family and home is something that men do not take on board. What we have done is we have said, oh, let me help you with this. Let me also do that. And occasionally, as my friend Johar Bhattacharya, I think, said in a chat thing, I didn't read all of these carefully, men also do the grand cooking on occasion. And Ambedkar, as I say in the book, actually does it. Takes 7 hours to cook a meal on one occasion, which I report. And in that 7 hours, everybody else is doing all the chores. He's performing the great thing of producing a meal which he is going to share. Now, it doesn't strike me that that's taking on responsibility, sharing family duties, and planning, nurturing, building in the way in which women have to do all the time, and young girls have to do in the family.
Thank you.
I fear that that's continued in ways that are troubling and that need more careful attention, including in my own case.
Okay, thank you. So related to the Jahar Bhattacharya's question, what you were talking, men may be allowed to cut vegetables but not cook to protect quality of food prep, hence the family's health. Do you think it is possible that women establish protective domains that eliminates or restrict male encroachment?
I think I saw that question. Okay, here it is. Men may be allowed to cut vegetables but not cook to protect quality of food preparation, hence the family's health. Johar, I'm slightly lost. I'm not quite sure what you're saying there. Do you think that it is possible that women establish protective domains that eliminate or restrict male encroachment? Yes, unfortunately, indeed they do. And we all know that older women in particular have a very strong hand in reproducing the hierarchies and the patriarchy and the privileges, the arrangements in our homes. But I'm not sure what you're saying about men may be allowed to cut vegetables but not cook to protect quality of food preparation. I'm a bit unclear on that one.
Thank you. So I'm gonna to invite a couple of people, those who have good comments there, although no questions. So 3 names come to my mind. Nishad Zaidi, Iram Gol, and Abdul Jabbar Saab. So let's begin with Abdul Jabbar.
So thank you for remembering my question regarding men. My son-in-law is a stay-at-home dad. He's a Texan. He's American. So I don't know whether this makes any difference, but I think he's taking care of 2 little children at home. It's a remarkable. I told him the other day, this is something I never experienced in my life. It's always women took care of children, that he's doing phenomenal work in terms of raising these 2 little kids. So I think it's apart from that, thank you for wonderful, fantastic presentation, very intellectual in exposition of ideas. As you know, I'm a biologist. I just go back to evolution it's a little bit. So that's why I just put it in the chat, in the Google, when you're talking about men. I just asked, so what is the evolution of the role of men from the era of hunter-gatherer. So it's a amazing AI overview gives you very good summary of that. So I just posted that. So clearly, the importance of the family, nuclear family, started a long time ago in the caves. So I think that is evolution, and then it's a very nice summary in terms of how the role of men evolved over millennia. So can you kind of your focus is on modern kind of things. Can you kind of little bit elaborate? Well, I think we are coming up late here, so the 1 o'clock in 10 minutes, 1 p.m. So can you kind of talk briefly, elaborate on that theme? Thank you very much. I promise you I'll come and see you in your office.
Absolutely,
It has been a while.
That would be a pleasure. We should do that.
Yeah.
Look, you're in a much better place than I am to talk about the evolution of man. And this is something you know about. I wouldn't even dare. I will say I'm a little troubled that AI is now telling us everything. And one just doesn't know where one's going with that. And I think we'll get one straight line telling us the truth, which is, as you know and as I know and my colleagues have emphasized, variety, variation, individual choice. These are all fundamental to the evolution of men, manliness, and so on. Your son-in-law is a good example of that. And I do want to suggest, I want to stress, it is not the case that men are not doing anything in the home.
Yeah.
There are many. In India, there are stay-at-home men who are doing exactly these kinds of jobs and who have been doing it for a while. It is not the norm. It is not the expectation. And my book was concerned with not the evolution of men and manliness through all time, which, as I say, I think you could probably do that much better than I, but about the reinstatement of patriarchal conditions, the re-establishment of masculine privilege as an almost unthought condition of domestic life in many parts of South Asia. Top to bottom. Many, many exceptions, there's no question. But you take the most remarkable of these people, let us say Babasaheb Ambedkar, let us say Narendra Yadav, let us say Rahul Sankritan, who are actually breaking the barriers in hundreds of ways, and yet fall back into that mode of thinking and articulating the natural conditions of being. Repeatedly. That return to patriarchy. And your one last thought. The idea that the men and women in a cave are in a nuclear family is just not, what's a nuclear family? There's no such notion there. There's a notion of people who live in this part and people who do not live in this part. There's our community. And this survives into the 20th and perhaps into the 21st centuries. There are the Dikus, the foreigners, the barbarians, the people who live beyond. There is us. And that does survive. But the idea of the nuclear family, that is a unit composed of husband-wife or husband-husband, wife-wife, whatever it may be, and a family as sacrosanct. The small, intimate circle is sacred. This is entirely new, and it is articulated and is worked through very interestingly in the colonial and post-colonial Indian. With that complication that 3 generations commonly live together, right? So what's the nuclear family? We have to work with that. We have to think.
Thank you. Great. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. So, very quick question from Shrikant Chopra Saab. How do you see the trajectory of development of these features in future? Would we see a copying of the Western model in India or see a more of an unsatisfactory hybrid of both?
Once again, I have to say, I mean, many of these are questions that are unanswerable. Certainly, I would not be in a position to answer them. I suspect that someone who asks that question has an answer, which is a good thing, and your answer would be as valid, as useful as anyone who thinks that they have worked out what the future will be. Because I doubt that we would be able to do it. I think one can say, on the basis of what has happened in India since the neoliberal turn, globalization, and the acceptance of only one path. There is no alternative. The path is now capitalism, profit making, the market. This is what in India, what you're getting is a lot of Indian English, which used for so long to be British English, of course, Indianized beautifully, is now so often American English. That's a statement of what is happening in but there's not an adoption of the kinds of practices or the kinds of struggles that are happening in Western Europe and in North America since the 1960s by most people who are wanting to be American, if you like. There is the simple adoption of symbolic language, of a kind of social media presence, of a commercial, a consumerist practice of being. Now, what does that tell us about what's going to happen in the future? Is it hybrid? It's not going to be hybrid in any simple sense. There's not an Indian way and a Western way which will come together. There are these diversities of inheritances and diverse kinds of practices existing in all of them. And there is hybridity in all of them, within them, from the beginning, right? And the question is how these will be articulated in different places and different times. My fear, my worry is that the symbolic will override any substantive struggle in many of these things, and those in power are able to make that happen, quite often through AI or AI type of work. You don't have to think. That's the short answer. Don't think. The answer is already available to us. So my own sense is, I don't know how to answer that question, but I suspect we have a very major struggle on our hands. The struggle primarily to be allowed to think and reflect upon the conditions of our being and what they should be.
Thank you. So this could be the last question from Abu Umair Saab. That you note that a man's emotional presence at home is often minimal or symbolic. In my research around the lower caste population in India, I see how shame and silence around vulnerability shape men's family lives. How do you think we can historicize these emotional absences? Are they colonial inheritances, product of caste and class, or ongoing negotiations of masculinity? How much you think that focusing on men's affective lives open up possibilities for change?
Again, I'm grateful for all of these questions, and I do want to say, in this particular instance, as in many others, the question itself has the answers embedded in it. It's already indicating what is necessary. I will only add to what you said is this particular proposition. I think the political dimension of the struggle is one that we should highlight, emphasize the whole time. It is not going to be the case that these things happen automatically. It is not the case that caste or class or gender has produced it in a particular way. These are articulated politically. The political movements matter. And I think, along with what I said earlier about our need to reflect upon where we live, how we live, what we would like to, how we think of the good society, the one that we're struggling with. We should recognize that there is a politics to every one of these aspects of being, and that politics is something we must attend to. I think the Dalits attended to it in quite remarkable ways and produced some quite astonishing moves, transformative moves, transformative possibilities. The Dalits, like the Muslims, like other minorities, are under threat of all kinds in the new arrangement of power and distribution of resources and privileges and rights in India, as they are in many other parts of the world, right? Minorities and marginalized and suppressed peoples. And so the political task of bringing together struggles, resistance, alternative possibilities, that remains to be addressed. And we are all part of it to the extent that we can be part of it.
Thank you. So a quick check on, I promised Nishad Zadi and Dr. Ramgul, if they want to say something quickly. Okay, looks like no.
I think Nishat is
Still there?
writing while driving or doing something outside. She's not physically present in it.
Oh, okay. So, but anyway, there is a comment. There's a good comment there, not a question. So, thank you so much. That concludes the question and answer session. Before we finish the session, I wanted to hand over back to Dr. Raziuddin for final remark. And once again, thank you all three speakers.
I thought that, Rafa, today you were supposed to ask one question. You should ask one question,
Go ahead, because this is already 1 o'clock. So,
okay. So the question is, within like this upper and lower strata of society, are there uniformity like within the communities also, like the Ashraf and the Badrloks, their behavior at home is also similar? That is one question. Secondly, I mean, the community to community level, like Ashraf versus the Badrlok, they are same class-wise, but whether culturally, domestically also, their behavior is similar. And the second is in the middle class, the maximum transformation comes within India is within the middle class, where the rigid man and woman distribution has really changed a lot due to more education, acquiring more education, because the new generation girls becoming wives and then mothers are also working ladies. So automatically men and the focus is also not having joint family. It's always now in the big towns, wife, husband, and kids. So automatically men have also transformed and became more like what a modern cosmopolitan family is, like sharing and doing other jobs, other tasks, going to school to pick up students, or buying outside, or doing dishes and all those. So there is a transformative change due to, I think, education, or due to less now focused families, husband, wife, and kids, and both are doing jobs. Is that not a change?
Once again, very large questions. And I think the short answer is yes, things have changed. My book suggests that they haven't changed as dramatically as we would like to believe. I think there's really, in your question, as in many of these articulations, there is an aspirational statement. This is what we would like to see. The idea that the nuclear family has come to reign, or that cosmopolitanism has come to reign, even in our most cosmopolitan cities, strikes me as just optimistic.
Uh-huh.
I can't say it any other. Your first question is just as important, which is, are the practices the same across class, upper and lower? Are they the same across community, Bhadrlok and Ashraf? And the answer is, of course not. Rituals, practices, whom you can marry, whom you cannot marry, these things differ dramatically. All of them have changed over time. The range of people you can marry, the sorts of things that are prohibited, all of this has changed. What I try to stress in the book is how certain underlying ways of thinking and being persist and reproduce themselves.
Yeah, my question was on that, not on how those social changes. Like men in Muslim families, upper caste men in Muslim families, and Bhadralok or upper caste men in Hindu families, or their women, their relations, their participation at home front is similar, or there was a difference then and there is a difference still, or
I want to say that in the India in which I grew up, and I think Kamran Bhai and Shapna, even if they didn't, we grew up after independence and after partition, all of us. And there, Shapna is distinctly of a later generation even than mine. But we still grew up in an India where there was a great deal that was shared. The Indo-Muslim heritage was our heritage. Hindi and Urdu were the same language. I spoke both. I now read both with some fluency. But that sort of thing has changed dramatically.
no, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about man in a Muslim family and man in a Hindu family at home. What
Yeah,
their behavior of doing things within their home, nothing to do with what is their relationship with.
I'm suggesting that their behavior in the home was very similar in many, many ways.
Oh, okay,
in
that's
different
what the
ways.
question.
And there is a struggle to change it
Mhm.
across the board. But I think we can be too optimistic in believing it has changed.
So both are mentally or emotionally similar, even though the level of conservatism is different, considered
Yes,
different.
If I may say something,
Yeah.
the couple of people like Akbar Mirza Sahab and Akhtar Hussain Raipuri, these are Bhadra log, actually.
Yeah.
Highly enlightened, highly educated. Akhtar Hussain Raipuri goes to Paris and, he's working on the Urdu dictionary with Abdul Haq in Hyderabad in the 1930s, marries a family, marries Hamida Sahiba, who's the daughter of a police officer, and the detective novelist Zafar Umar. I mean, these are the brothers. Shaukat Umar goes to Cambridge in 1935. This is an elite family who's also marrying into through not only into Rampur Nawabs but also into Nehru's family. So this is a very complicated milieu that we don't understand today. And if you look at their lives, and Akbar Sahab's wife is of course Rashid Jahan's sister, who's also a TV and a film actor, is a film actor before and then later a TV actor. So it's not like she's some stay-at-home person. But their lives and what Professor Pandey has told us about lives of people like Bachchan Saab or even Rajendra Prasad or others is not very dissimilar in this domestic realm. What he's trying to say is that there are unsaid gestures that in the public realm these are very important, enlightened, modern state leaders, but in the home there are sort of invisibilities or ways of forgetfulness or way. So I think
Okay.
that's where the issue. Sorry if I'm misinterpreting you, Gyan. Go ahead.
That's fine.
No,
So,
Kamran, as always, more eloquently said. Thank you.
Yeah.
okay. I think it is getting a little really late. It is crossed 2 hours, and so thank you all. It was wonderful, very stimulating, and very intellectually challenging. Really, you make us feel very guilty, the men. You know how much we change really. I used to be just sitting at the couch, and my wife used to make tea for me. We both came out from the same labs, equally educated, gone to lab at the same time coming home. I will go to sit in the couch and she will make tea. And this change, I think, is still not that much change, but change. So it is of how we grew up, groomed. Anyway, thank you very much. And we'll see sometime
Thank
again.
you. Thank you once
Thank
again.
you so much. Thanks a
Okay.
lot.
Razi Bhai, may I just, on behalf of all of us, my colleagues and friends who've come from other places, thank you for continuing to run what is a remarkable platform. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for taking the patience with which you have taken our times and our waffling.
We all
Thanks to Kamran and to Shopna especially.
we
but
all are
very
getting
much.
in touch with all the knowledge and all the informations. It's
Thank
all
you
very
so much.
beneficial to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Razi Bhai, again, Kamran Bhai. It's a real pleasure.
You are in Brooklyn?
I'm in Brooklyn. I'm at College of the Graduate Center.
Okay, my younger daughter lives in Brooklyn.
Okay,
Uh,
say hi to him.
No, thank you, Razi Saab, Rafat Saab. Gyan, thank you, and thank you for writing the books, Swapna ji.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.